Decided she wouldn't let history repeat itself, not on her watch. She returned to the cabin and continued her observations, keeping a discreet eye on Melania. As the flight progressed, Sarah found herself glancing over at the woman repeatedly. Her movements were poised, her posture immaculate, and her mannerisms gentle but firm. Yet, her understated elegance didn't quell Sarah's doubts, it only deepened her curiosity. Meanwhile, Melania continued reading her magazine, seemingly unaware of Sarah's scrutiny. Every now and then, she would glance out the window, her face serene as if lost in thought. She occasionally sipped on her glass of water, declining the champagne offered by another flight attendant earlier. The cabin crew began serving the gourmet meal. Sarah, still uneasy, took it upon herself to personally serve Melania, hoping a closer interaction might provide some answers. She approached with a professional smile, carrying a tray of meticulously plated dishes. "Would you like the seared salmon or the filet mignon, ma'am?" Sarah asked, her voice even and polite, but her eyes subtly searching for clues. Melania looked up, her soft blue eyes meeting Sarah's. "The salmon, please," she said, her voice calm and polite, with a slight European accent. Sarah noted the accent, wondering if it hinted at Melania's background. As Sarah placed the tray in front of her, she couldn't help but notice Melania's graceful hands, her nails neatly manicured but without any flashy polish. Everything about her seemed deliberately simple, yet effortlessly refined. "Thank you," Melania said with a warm smile that caught Sarah off guard. It wasn't the forced politeness she often encountered in first class but something genuine. Sarah nodded, muttering a quiet, "You're welcome," before stepping back. Back in the service area, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. She glanced at the passenger list again, scanning the names for any clue. But there was nothing unusual, no name that stood out, no sign of irregularity. Emily noticed Sarah's preoccupation and decided to speak up. "Miss Sarah, don't you think you might be overthinking this? She seems polite and hasn't caused any trouble. Maybe she's just someone who likes her privacy." Sarah sighed, her brows furrowed. "Maybe, but I can't help it, Emily. It's my job to make sure everything is in order. And this just feels out of place." Emily smiled softly. "Sometimes, people aren't what they seem, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Maybe she has her reasons for being low-key." Sarah nodded, though her mind remained restless. She decided to let it go for the moment, focusing on her other duties. As the flight continued, Sarah kept glancing at Melania, who remained composed and unbothered. The rest of the passengers in first class were typical of what Sarah was used to: loud phone calls, designer outfits, and constant demands for attention. In contrast, Melania's quiet demeanor stood out even more. Eventually, the flight began its descent. As the plane prepared to land, Sarah found herself standing near the first-class cabin, observing the passengers as they gathered their belongings. Melania remained seated, calmly waiting for the plane to touch down before making any move. When the plane landed and the seatbelt sign turned off, the passengers began standing up, retrieving their bags, and preparing to disembark. Melania, however, waited patiently, allowing others to leave before her. Sarah watched as she gracefully rose from her seat, retrieved her bag, and walked toward the exit. As Melania stepped into the jet bridge, a man waiting near the exit suddenly approached her. He was tall, well-dressed, and clearly someone of importance. "Madam First Lady," he said respectfully, bowing his head slightly. "Your car is ready." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. The words echoed in her mind, "Madam First Lady." In that moment, she realized who Melania was. The former First Lady of the United States, one of the most recognized figures in the world. A wave of disbelief and embarrassment washed over Sarah. How had she not recognized her? The understated elegance, the quiet confidence, the accent, it all made sense now. Emily, standing beside Sarah, looked equally stunned. "That was Melania Trump," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah nodded slowly, her face pale. She felt a mix of emotions: shock, regret, and a tinge of humiliation. All her doubts, her suspicions, and her scrutiny now seemed so unnecessary, even foolish. As Melania disappeared into the crowd, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on her own actions throughout the flight. She had judged a woman based on her appearance, failing to see beyond the surface. The experience was a humbling reminder of the importance of humility and respect, regardless of status or outward presentation. Anticipation, leaning in closer to hear the man's response. He turned his phone toward her, revealing an image of the former First Lady, Melania Trump. "It's her," he said in a hushed voice, the revelation tinged with disbelief and awe. The young woman gasped softly, her gaze darting between the phone and the poised woman seated nearby. "Are you sure?" she whispered, trying to keep her voice down. "I mean, she doesn't look as glamorous as she usually does." The elderly man nodded. "Sometimes, the most powerful people don't need to flaunt it. It's unmistakable. That's her." The realization began to ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, murmurs growing louder as more people pieced together the truth. A couple seated near the front leaned toward each other, their hushed conversation laced with excitement. "Why would she be on a commercial flight?" the man asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "Maybe she wanted to avoid attention," his companion replied, her voice tinged with admiration. "But she certainly didn't escape it now." Back in the aisle, Sarah's mind raced as she noticed the change in the cabin's energy. Her instinct to protect the sanctity of the first-class experience had been so strong, yet she now felt the weight of a possible error. Her professional pride was at odds with the creeping realization that she might have misjudged the situation entirely. Melania, seemingly unfazed by the growing whispers around her, remained seated, her demeanor a portrait of composed grace. Her silence was not out of defeat but out of an understanding that the situation would resolve itself without further confrontation. She was no stranger to the world of judgment, scrutiny, and misunderstandings. Her life had often been a public spectacle, but moments like these reminded her that humility could be the most powerful response. Emily, observing the unfolding scene from the service area, hesitated before approaching Sarah. She gently touched her arm and leaned in, whispering, "Sarah, I think you need to take another look at who she might be. People are starting to recognize her." Sarah turned to Emily, her professional mask slipping slightly as doubt clouded her expression. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice low but strained. Emily glanced toward Melania before replying, "I overheard a passenger say they think she's Melania Trump. You know, the former First Lady." The words hit Sarah like a gust of wind, leaving her momentarily speechless. Her eyes flicked back to Melania, and she suddenly noticed details she had overlooked before: the regal posture, the effortless elegance, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence. It all began to make sense. For a moment, Sarah felt a mix of emotions: embarrassment, disbelief, and a growing sense of regret. How could she have missed it? She had prided herself on her ability to read people, to maintain impeccable standards of service, and yet she had failed to recognize someone of such prominence. Her actions, though rooted in professionalism, now felt like overstepping boundaries. Summoning her courage, Sarah approached Melania once more, her demeanor noticeably softer this time. She paused beside the seat, her hands clasped in front of her as she spoke. "Ma'am, I'd like to apologize if I caused you any inconvenience. It seems I may have misjudged the situation." Melania looked up, her expression unreadable but not unkind. She regarded Sarah for a moment before responding, her voice calm and measured. "It's all right. We all have our duties, and I understand yours. But sometimes, it's important to approach situations with an open mind." Sarah nodded, the weight of Melania's words sinking in. "Thank you for understanding," she said quietly, before stepping away to allow the former First Lady her peace. The rest of the flight continued without incident, but the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted. The passengers, now aware of Melania's presence, treated her with a newfound respect, though none dared to disturb her. Sarah, meanwhile, carried out her duties with a renewed sense of humility, reflecting on the lessons she had learned from the encounter. Though unspoken, the incident served as a reminder to everyone on board: appearances can be deceiving, and true elegance often lies in simplicity and grace. Response barely audible: "Thank you, ma'am. I'll reflect on this." The weight of her words seemed almost inadequate, but they carried the sincerity of someone deeply moved by an experience that had shaken her to her core. The atmosphere in the cabin remained tense, though it had shifted slightly. While some passengers exchanged knowing glances, others remained quiet, perhaps reflecting on their own biases. A child a few seats away tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking in a whisper, "Mom, is she famous?" The mother hushed him gently, her eyes fixed on Melania, admiration apparent on her face. Melania sat back in her seat, retrieving the magazine she had been reading earlier, though her calm demeanor now carried an undeniable sense of finality. Her elegance seemed effortless, as though the confrontation had not rattled her in the slightest. Yet the ripples of her words continued to resonate through the cabin. As the murmurs subsided and the passengers gradually returned to their prior activities, Sarah stood rooted to the spot, as though trying to piece together everything that had transpired. The lessons of the moment were not just about her lapse in judgment but about the broader implications of treating others with dignity and respect, regardless of status or appearance. The man who had first identified Melania caught Sarah's eye. His gaze wasn't one of reproach but rather a silent encouragement, as if to tell her that mistakes, while painful, were opportunities to grow. Sarah gave him a small nod, acknowledging his support, though it did little to ease the deep embarrassment still simmering within her. Nearby, an elderly couple leaned toward each other, speaking in hushed tones. "She handled that so gracefully," the woman remarked, her admiration evident. "It's not just about who she is, it's about how she carries herself." "That's class." Her husband nodded thoughtfully, his gaze shifting between Melania and Sarah. As Sarah finally turned to leave, her steps felt heavier than before. Every movement seemed deliberate, as though she were carrying the weight of the entire interaction on her shoulders. She glanced briefly at Melania, who was now flipping through the pages of her magazine, her expression serene. There was no malice in her face, no trace of resentment, just an unshakable calm that spoke of a deeper strength. Returning to the service area, Sarah leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath to steady herself. One of her colleagues approached, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, her voice low so as not to draw attention. Sarah nodded slowly, though her expression was one of someone processing a profound moment of self-awareness. "I'm fine," she replied, though the words lacked conviction. She knew this experience would stay with her for a long time, serving as a stark reminder of how quickly assumptions could lead to misjudgments. From her seat, Melania glanced out of the window, her face reflecting a quiet contentment. The sky outside was a canvas of soft blues and whites, the horizon stretching infinitely in every direction. Though the encounter had likely disrupted her peace, she showed no sign of lingering discomfort. Instead, her demeanor suggested a person who had long ago learned to rise above the noise and focus on what truly mattered. The passengers around her gradually resumed their conversations, though the energy in the cabin had subtly shifted. A few exchanged knowing glances, silently acknowledging the powerful message that had just been delivered. The young attorney from earlier leaned toward his companion, his tone reflective. "That was something else," he said. "It wasn't just about who she is, it's about how she made everyone think twice about their own actions." His companion nodded in agreement, her expression pensive. She didn't have to say much, but every word carried weight. It's rare to see someone handle a situation like that with so much poise. As the flight continued, the tension from the confrontation slowly gave way to a more subdued atmosphere. Yet, the memory of what had transpired lingered in the minds of the passengers, a quiet reminder of the power of grace and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. In the service area, Sarah busied herself with her duties, though her mind remained elsewhere. She replayed the encounter in her head, each word and action echoing like a lesson etched into her memory. She knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but she resolved to let it shape her into a better person and a more conscientious professional. Melania, meanwhile, remained a figure of quiet composure, her presence a subtle but undeniable influence on the space around her. Though she spoke no further, her earlier words continued to resonate, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed the exchange. The man's voice carried a hint of triumph as he lifted his phone, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. "Look," he said, showing it to the passenger beside him. "It's her. First Lady Melania Trump." The murmurs started immediately, spreading like a ripple across the cabin. Heads turned with curiosity, expressions shifting as people began to examine the woman more closely. Some passengers pulled out their own phones, covertly glancing between their screens and the woman seated in front of them. "Really? Melania Trump? What's she doing here?" someone whispered, their voice rising with incredulity. Another, more skeptical, passenger added, "Impossible. If that's her, why didn't the flight attendant recognize her? The whispers grew louder, a low hum of speculation that buzzed around the first-class cabin. Meanwhile, Sarah, the flight attendant at the center of it all, remained frozen in confusion. She noticed the shift in the atmosphere, the intensity of the passengers' gazes suddenly turning on her, but she couldn't piece together what was happening. Then, cutting through the mounting tension like a knife, a voice called out from the side, "Don't you recognize her? That's Melania Trump." Sarah's heart sank. She whipped her head toward the man who had spoken, her eyes searching his for an answer. But it was her own gaze, now turning back to the passenger in question, that sealed her fate. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. The woman she had assumed to be just another traveler now stood out, her striking features unmistakable, her composed demeanor radiating an unspoken authority. Sarah's breath caught as recognition finally set in. She had made a grave mistake. The elderly man's words seemed to echo in the now quiet cabin. All eyes were on Sarah, their collective disbelief like a weight pressing down on her chest. She glanced back at the woman, who remained seated, her sharp blue eyes calm and unwavering. There was no anger in her expression, no visible frustration, just a quiet poise that made Sarah's stomach churn with regret. She had misjudged her, misread her entirely. The woman's silence was far more powerful than any words could have been. Sarah's cheeks burned as the blood rushed to her face. Her voice, when she finally found it, came out trembling but professional. I'm so sorry if I caused you any trouble." Her words faltered as she tried to justify herself, but she knew deep down there was no excuse for what had happened. She had acted out of suspicion, perhaps even prejudice, and now she stood exposed in front of everyone. A young passenger nearby chuckled softly, breaking the silence. "It's her. Look at this," he said, holding up his phone. On the screen were pictures of Melania Trump, some from glamorous galas, others from public appearances. How could anyone not recognize her? He added with a smirk. Sarah's eyes flicked to the phone, the images confirming what she already knew. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, no longer whispers but audible critiques. "How could a flight attendant not know who she is?" One passenger scoffed. "And to question her like that? Ridiculous," another chimed in. The words cut through Sarah like shards of glass. She had prided herself on professionalism, on treating her passengers with respect, and yet here she was, the focus of open criticism. Melania, still seated, adjusted her posture and looked at Sarah. Her expression remained composed, but when she finally spoke, her voice was calm and deliberate. "I don't think who I am should matter in how you treat a passenger." The simplicity of her words carried a profound weight. Sarah felt her knees threaten to buckle. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Melania continued, her tone steady. "Respect is not about recognition or status. It's about how you choose to treat people, every single one of them." The cabin fell silent. A few passengers began nodding in agreement, while others murmured their approval. One woman seated behind Melania stood up and addressed the group. "She's absolutely right. This is first class, but that doesn't mean anyone has the right to treat someone like they don't belong." Sarah's head hung low, the enormity of her error sinking in. She glanced around the cabin, the disapproving stares from the passengers making her feel smaller with every passing second. She realized then that it wasn't just her professionalism that had been called into question, it was her character. She had judged someone based on appearances, and now she was facing the consequences of that judgment. Melania rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and calm. "This isn't about an apology," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "It's about reflection. I hope this experience gives you the opportunity to reconsider how you approach your role. Respect shouldn't be conditional, it should be inherent." Her words lingered in the air, their impact resonating not just with Sarah but with everyone present. The cabin grew quieter still, the faint hum of the engines now the only sound. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes as she struggled to hold her composure. She took a shaky breath and stepped back, retreating to the galley as Melania returned to her seat. In the service area, Sarah gripped the counter for support, her mind racing. She replayed the events over and over, each detail adding to her growing sense of shame. She thought about Melania's words, about the way she had handled the situation with grace and dignity. Sarah realized that this moment would stay with her, not as a source of embarrassment but as a lesson, one that she needed to carry forward in her career and in her life. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Passengers resumed their activities, but the energy in the room was different. Conversations were quieter, more reflective. One older man turned to his seatmate and said, "It's not often you see someone handle a situation like that with such poise." She didn't have to say much, but the message was loud and clear. Sarah stood in the galley, staring at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Her uniform was pristine, her hair neatly tied back, but she barely recognized herself. She thought about the values she had always tried to uphold and realized how far she had strayed from them in that moment. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and stepped back into the cabin. She couldn't undo what had happened, but she could make a choice to be better, to do better. As she moved down the aisle, she caught Melania's eye. The former First Lady gave her a small, understanding nod. It wasn't forgiveness that Sarah saw in that gesture, it was an invitation to grow, to learn, and to change. Doubted herself, she would recall Melania's calm and dignified demeanor, a reminder of the lesson she had learned. The whispers from that flight, the pointed glances, and the discreetly taken photographs no longer haunted her but served as reminders of a pivotal moment that changed her perspective on humanity. She made an effort to go beyond her duties, treating every passenger as though they were the most important person on the plane, no matter their appearance, status, or background. Her colleagues began to notice a change in her, a quiet determination in the way she carried herself and a newfound warmth in her interactions. Sarah wasn't just doing her job anymore, she was on a mission to ensure no one else experienced the discomfort she had once caused. Passengers started complimenting her service, and her supervisors took note of her transformation. The incident with Melania, which could have been a blemish on her career, became the catalyst for her growth. She began to see her role as more than just a job. It was an opportunity to make a small but meaningful difference in people's lives, one flight at a time. Meanwhile, Melania's quiet reaction to the incident continued to ripple through the public conversation. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a tale of humility and grace. Commentators debated the broader implications, pointing out the biases people often carry unconsciously, even in professional settings. The story prompted discussions on social media about kindness, forgiveness, and the need for empathy in all aspects of life. Sarah, who initially felt mortified seeing the story spread, gradually came to view it as a blessing in disguise. She began following the conversations online, not to relive her mistake, but to understand how others were interpreting the situation. She read comments from people who shared their own stories of bias, redemption, and lessons learned. It reminded her that she wasn't alone in her journey, and that everyone, in their own way, was working to overcome their imperfections. One evening, Sarah received an email from a former passenger who had been on the same flight. The email was from the sharp-dressed businessman who had whispered to his companion about how remarkable Melania's demeanor had been. He wrote to Sarah, acknowledging her courage in apologizing and expressing how much her transformation on that flight had inspired him. He shared, "We all make mistakes, Sarah. The fact that you owned yours and made amends showed true character. It was a reminder to me and everyone else on that flight that change starts with recognition and accountability. Keep being an example." Moved by his words, Sarah replied, thanking him for his kindness. She began to understand that while the incident had been painful, it had also opened doors to connection and understanding that she had never anticipated. As time passed, Sarah became known among her peers for her empathy and professionalism. She was no longer the flight attendant who had made an embarrassing mistake, she was someone who had risen above it, using the experience to grow. Her story was even shared at a company training seminar as an example of how to turn challenges into opportunities for personal development. Despite her growing confidence, Sarah remained humble. She never forgot the lessons she had learned or the grace Melania had shown her. She often thought about the handwritten note and bouquet that had arrived at her doorstep, a simple but profound gesture of forgiveness that had meant the world to her. On particularly challenging flights, Sarah would glance at a small keepsake she carried with her, a folded copy of Melania's reply. It reminded her of the woman who had shown her that kindness and understanding were the most powerful responses to adversity. Sarah also took steps to broaden her perspective. She enrolled in diversity and inclusion workshops and began volunteering at community centers during her time off. She wanted to ensure that the biases she had once carried would never resurface, and that she would continue to grow as a person both on and off the job. Her journey of self-improvement wasn't always easy. There were moments of self-doubt, and occasionally, memories of that fateful flight would resurface, causing her to cringe. But she always reminded herself that progress wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence and the willingness to learn. Years later, Sarah would look back on that flight as a turning point in her life. What had started as a moment of embarrassment and regret had evolved into a story of growth, resilience, and redemption. It wasn't just about how she had treated Melania Trump, but about how she had learned to treat everyone with dignity, respect, and an open heart. Sarah found herself revisiting the events of that day on the flight, a moment that shifted her perception of herself and others. It wasn't just about her mistake, it was about what she learned and how it transformed her approach to life. Whenever she caught herself slipping into judgment, Sarah remembered Melania's calmness and grace. The quiet dignity Melania displayed that day didn't just leave an impression, it reshaped Sarah's understanding of humanity and humility. The story of Melania Trump on a commercial flight rapidly became a social media sensation. Images of her sitting quietly, reading a magazine, coupled with posts recounting the incident, spread like wildfire. A tweet by a freelance journalist, who had been in the first-class cabin, garnered immense attention. It read, "Melania Trump on a commercial flight, calm and poised." But the treatment she received highlights biases in the service industry. Accompanied by a discreet photo, the tweet sparked a massive conversation about respect, prejudice, and the service industry's role in perpetuating stereotypes. People marveled at Melania's grace in a situation that could have spiraled into public confrontation. An article in a renowned magazine commented, "Melania Trump's silence spoke louder than words. Her composed demeanor serves as a lesson that respect transcends power and fame." Social media platforms flooded with admiration for her, while also pointing out the biases present in how people are often treated based on appearances. Critics were harsh toward Sarah, viewing her actions as emblematic of larger systemic issues within the service industry. The airline faced its share of criticism, with many calling for stricter training on professionalism and implicit bias. Sarah read the coverage with a heavy heart. Each article, tweet, and comment felt like another spotlight on her mistake. Yet, instead of retreating into denial or shame, she chose to confront the situation head-on. Sarah approached her manager, admitted her error, and requested additional training. She emphasized her willingness to learn, not just for herself but to help the airline foster a culture of respect and empathy. At an internal meeting with her colleagues, Sarah shared her story openly. Her voice trembled, but she spoke with sincerity, saying, "I let my biases affect how I treated a passenger, and that was wrong. This experience has taught me that professionalism is about more than just following procedures, it's about seeing and respecting everyone equally, no matter who they are or how they appear." Her admission wasn't just an apology, it was a declaration of her commitment to change. Gradually, Sarah returned to her duties with a renewed sense of purpose. Passengers began to notice the difference in her demeanor. Her interactions became warmer, more genuine. A review from a frequent flyer read, "Sarah Montgomery is a remarkable flight attendant. Her kindness and attention to detail made the journey unforgettable." Her colleagues saw the shift in her as well, noting her newfound patience and compassion. Meanwhile, Melania continued her life away from the public eye, but the incident further cemented her image as a person of quiet strength and humility. A leading newspaper remarked, "Melania Trump exemplifies how grace can turn even the most challenging moments into powerful lessons." Her reaction that day reminded us all that respect is not earned by status but is a fundamental human right. The story, however, wasn't just about Sarah and Melania. It sparked larger conversations across forums, workplaces, and social media platforms. People shared their own stories of being judged unfairly or realizing their own biases. One popular quote from the incident, attributed to Melania, resonated widely: "Respect should not depend on identity. It is something everyone deserves." The phrase became a rallying cry for many, a reminder of the importance of treating everyone with dignity. Sarah's journey didn't stop with the apology or the training. She began actively participating in initiatives within her airline to improve service and inclusivity. She attended workshops on emotional intelligence and implicit bias, volunteered to mentor new flight attendants, and even helped design a training module that emphasized the importance of treating every passenger with respect. Her colleagues began to see her not just as someone who had made a mistake but as a leader who had transformed that mistake into a mission. Months later, Sarah was recognized by her airline as one of their most dedicated and compassionate employees. The award ceremony was attended by her peers, and Sarah used the moment to reflect on her journey. In her speech, she said, "Mistakes don't define us. It's how we choose to respond to them that matters. I'm grateful for the lesson I learned that day and for the opportunity to grow from it. We can all be better if we're willing to look inward and make changes." As for Melania, she never commented publicly on the incident. Her silence was consistent with her personality, letting her actions and demeanor speak louder than words. But her reaction that day continued to inspire others. Those who had witnessed the exchange firsthand often spoke of her humility and grace, and her handling of the situation became a benchmark for professionalism and kindness. The story, initially seen as a minor incident on a flight, grew into a broader narrative about the power of respect and the importance of addressing one's biases. It became a lesson that transcended the individuals involved, reminding everyone that even small interactions can carry profound meaning. Mistakes are inevitable, but the choice to learn from them defines character. The story of Melania Trump and Sarah Montgomery serves as a powerful reminder that respect and humility are not just virtues but necessities in building a more compassionate world.